Picture this. You're sitting beside a small fire, somewhere just past the edge of the light. Two eyes are watching you, not attacking, not running, just watching, waiting to see if you'll toss a scrap of meat its way. What did ancient humans keep as pets 500,000 years ago? Here's the honest answer. Before we go any further, they probably didn't keep pets at all. Not 500,000 years ago, not even close. But stick with that disappointment for a second, because the real story turns out to be stranger, and in some ways more moving, than the myth. Let's start with what keeping a pet actually requires, biologically and behaviorally, because it's a much higher bar than most people assume. A pet relationship means an animal has been genetically and behaviorally reshaped across generations to tolerate, and even seek out, close contact with humans. That's not something that happens in one lifetime. It's a slow-motion negotiation between two species, stretched across thousands of years. So when did that negotiation actually begin? Not with cats, not with birds. It began, almost certainly, with wolves. The oldest widely accepted physical evidence comes from a site called Bonn-Oberkassel, in what is now Germany, first uncovered by quarry workers back in 1914. Inside a shared grave, alongside the skeletons of an adult man and woman, researchers found the remains of a dog. In 2018, a team led by veterinary researcher Luc Janssens re-examined those bones using modern techniques, and the findings were remarkable. This dog, radiocarbon dated to roughly 14,200 years old, had suffered from a severe case of canine distemper as a puppy, a disease that would have made it extremely sick, incontinent, and almost certainly unable to contribute anything useful, like hunting or guarding. And yet it survived that illness for weeks, maybe months, based on the healing visible in its teeth. Someone had to feed it, clean up after it, and keep it warm during that entire stretch, getting nothing back in return. Janssens and his colleagues argued this wasn't utilitarian animal keeping. This was something closer to what we'd recognize today as an act of love. 14,000 years. That's the safest, most widely agreed upon anchor point for the origin of the pet dog. But is that really the beginning of the story? Or just the point where the evidence gets undeniable? Push further back, and things get murkier, and far more contested. At a place called Razboinichya Cave, tucked into the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia, researcher Nikolai Ovidov and an international team examined a remarkably well-preserved skull and jaw, using radiocarbon dating cross-checked across 3 separate laboratories. They arrived at an age of roughly 33,000 years, placing it firmly among the oldest candidate dogs ever found. Detailed measurements of the skull, snout width, and tooth crowding patterns showed it looked far more like a domesticated dog than a wild wolf. But here's the twist inside the twist. That same research team concluded this particular animal likely represents a false start, a population of wolves that began drifting toward domestication, only to have that process interrupted, probably by the brutal climate shift of the last glacial maximum, the coldest stretch of the last ice age. In other words, humans may have accidentally started domesticating dogs more than once, in different places, and some of those early experiments simply didn't survive long enough to leave descendants. A similar, still debated case comes from a site called Prehistory in the Czech Republic, roughly 26 to 27,000 years old. Paleontologist Miege Germanpra and her colleagues identified several skulls there with shorter snouts and wider brain cases than any wolf on record, features she interprets as early signs of domestication. One particularly striking specimen was found with a fragment of mammoth bone carefully placed inside its mouth after death, an object that shows up nowhere else in the surrounding graves, hinting at some kind of deliberate, symbolic treatment. Not every researcher agrees with that interpretation. Critics have argued these skulls might simply represent an unusual, specialized type of wolf adapted to scavenging carcasses on the mammoth steppe, not proto-dogs at all. This disagreement isn't a flaw in the science. It's exactly how science is supposed to work. Real researchers, genuinely arguing over ambiguous bones, because getting it right matters more than getting a tidy answer. What about cats, though? Surely if dogs took tens of thousands of years, cats must go back just as far. Not even close. The evidence for cat domestication points to somewhere around 9 to 10,000 years ago, tied closely to the rise of early farming settlements in the Near East. Archaeological work on the island of Cyprus uncovered a grave, roughly 9,500 years old, containing a human skeleton buried deliberately alongside the skeleton of a wild cat, positioned in a way that mirrors the much later Bonn-Oberkassel dog burial. Cats, It turns out, likely domesticated themselves too, drawn not to hunting camps like wolves, but to the granaries of early farmers, where stored grain attracted rodents, and rodents attracted cats. Humans didn't go looking for a mouser. The mousers showed up on their own, once agriculture gave them a reason to. So even at the very outer edge of the evidence, pushed as far back as the data can honestly stretch, you're looking at somewhere between 26,000 and 33,000 years, not 500,000. That's a gap of nearly 500,000 years between the premise of this video and what the fossil record can actually support. So what was actually happening 500,000 years ago, if not pet keeping? At that point in time, you're looking at populations like Homo heidelbergensis and early Homo erectus, species that had already mastered stone tools and, in some regions, the beginnings of controlled fire. But there's no genetic or archaeological signature anywhere in that period showing any animal species being reshaped by proximity to humans. No skeletal changes, no burials, no signs of an animal being fed and cared for outside of being hunted and eaten. What you do find, if you look at wolves specifically, is something more like a slow orbit than a relationship. Wherever ancient human hunting groups left behind bones, scraps, and carcasses, wolves would have followed at a distance, scavenging whatever was left. This is sometimes called the self-domestication hypothesis, an idea most associated with biologist Raymond Coppinger, who argued that the wolves who tolerated human proximity best, staying calm instead of fleeing, would have gained a steady food source their more skittish relatives didn't. Over enormous stretches of time, natural selection would have quietly favored calmer, friendlier wolves, without a single human ever deciding to tame one on purpose. Let's reconstruct that scene, because it's worth sitting with. A group of hunters returns to camp after a long day, carrying the remains of a kill. They butcher it near the fire, discarding bones and unwanted scraps at the camp's edge. As darkness falls, shapes gather just beyond the firelight. Drawn by the smell, most of the group ignores them. A child, watching one particular wolf return night after night, starts tossing its scraps on purpose. The wolf doesn't attack. It waits. It comes a little closer than the others. Nobody in that scene thinks they're founding a 10,000-year relationship between two species. They're just sharing scraps with something that hasn't hurt them yet. Here's the counterintuitive twist that should reshape how you think about your own pets. You'd expect that domestication started because humans had a clear plan, deciding one day to breed a friendlier wolf for protection or hunting help. The evidence suggests almost the opposite. The wolves largely domesticated themselves first, through their own tolerance for human presence. And only later did humans begin actively shaping which ones got to stick around and breed. In other words, your dog's ancestors may have applied for the job long before humans ever posted it. Now bring this back to whatever's sitting in your house right now, judging you for how long you took to fill its food bowl. Every dog on the planet today descends through an unbroken chain stretching back at minimum 14,000 years. From wolves who made a calculated bet that staying close to a human campfire was safer than staying wild. That bet paid off so completely that their descendants have gone from scavenging scraps in the dark to sleeping on couches and getting their own furniture. So, what did ancient humans keep as pets 500,000 years ago? Nothing. Not one single thing. And that nothing is actually the more interesting answer, because it means the bond between humans and dogs isn't ancient in some vague, misty, prehistoric sense. It's a specific, traceable, documented event, or maybe several independent events, that happened again and again across tens of thousands of years, sometimes succeeding, sometimes failing, until one lineage of formerly wild wolves became the single most successful animal partnership our species has ever formed. You're sitting beside a fire again, except now the fire is a lamp, and the eyes watching you from across the room aren't wondering whether you're dangerous. They already know you're not. They're just wondering when dinner is.